Hey, RetconRaider here. Before we get started, I'd just like to give special thanks to the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible. With special thanks to Victoria Babenko, who provided me with a lot of extremely valuable lore that I might have otherwise missed. Thanks, guys. I could not have done this without you. Now, for those of you who have been following my Wasteland 3 series, you may have noticed that I sometimes tend to get hung up on seemingly trivial bits and pieces of lore. This was the case back in episodes 34 and 35, when I, admittedly, got a bit sidetracked with trying to analyze the mystery of the wives of the Patriarch. It's certainly not the first time something like that has happened. My love of trying to puzzle out obscure connections between fragmented bits of lore dates all the way back to some of my earliest videos, with games like Phoenix Point and Fallout Van Buren, and Wasteland 3 is no exception. In this particular case, I found the mystery of the Patriarch's wives to be truly fascinating because, with the information we uncovered in episode 34, various disparate bits and pieces of information all started to come together to create an incomplete, but rather intriguing picture. Ultimately, it's something that has no real bearing on the launch version of the game, at least in regards to the core plot and the issues that are currently facing the Colorado territory. But this hidden story within a story did at least seem to imply motivations and some potentially startling revelations about how the Patriarch ended up in his current situation. That said, this does get a bit complex, so I'll try to make it a little simpler by presenting my findings as a timeline. I'll walk you through the events in the order I believe they occurred, and supplement it with my own sources and speculation. That said, let's get started. Now, as with many stories, let's start at the beginning. Tuesday, April 18th, 2028. According to a commemorative plaque that the player can find in Broadmoor Park, Saul Buchanan was born on this day. This would make him roughly 79 years old by the time the events of Wasteland 3 take place. It's one of the very few concrete dates that we have to work with, so it serves as a vital anchor point to help determine the placement of a lot of the later events. Although not directly related, it is interesting to note that Old Baldy, the animatronic mascot at the Buchanan Museum, does imply that Saul Buchanan had siblings. It specifically refers to him as the youngest son of the Buchanan clan. But no other mention of any brothers or sisters is ever made, so I guess we'll just ignore that for now. I will say, however, that there is a lot to talk about where the Patriarch is concerned, but the vast majority of that falls well beyond the scope of this particular video. More notably, that would delve much more deeply into spoilers about the main story, and given that my own gameplay series is still ongoing, we're not going to do that. Not today anyway, though that is something that I would like to revisit and analyze someday. No, today we're just going to be focusing on Saul Buchanan's 3 wives, Livia, Laura, and Cleo, as well as his 3 children, Victory, Liberty, and Valor. We'll also be discussing how the Patriarch's actions impacted all of them, for better or worse, though that will admittedly delve into a lot of general speculation and armchair psychiatry. But hey, I think it's still some pretty fascinating stuff. Now, with that one date, we can actually start to construct our rough timeline. The next start date we have to work with is the year 2059, which the player can find on the portrait of Livia Buchanan in the Patriarch's Palace. There's not much to say here just yet, but this does appear to be the year that they presumably got married. That would seem to indicate that Saul was roughly 31 years old when he took his first wife. Then we have Legend, the 60-page novella available with certain versions of Wasteland 3, which indicates that the Patriarch's official rise to power took place when he was in his mid-30s. This would place it roughly around 2063, and by this point, Livia was pregnant with his first child. Victory will confirm in-game that each of the Patriarch's children were born to a different wife, and that his mother was in fact Livia. Given that his birth would have been around the same time that Saul had first secured his hold on Colorado around 2064, it's pretty likely that Victory's name is intended to commemorate this monumental accomplishment. Again, there's a lot to talk about there, but we're just going to touch on the most basic details at the moment. Based on legend, we can assume that Victory was born around 2064, which would make him roughly 43 years old by the time the game takes place in 2107. This actually tracks with what the developers have said in the past, that Victory was intended to be about 40 years old, while his two siblings were intended to be younger, in their 30s. According to Victory, his mother died when he was still just a baby, and the Patriarch claims that Victory's history of cruelty and wanton violence began when he was still just a baby. Although there are numerous references to Victory's youthful cruelty and destructive nature throughout the game, the first actual hard date we have for one of these acts is much later in 2073. So let's set that aside for the moment, and we'll come back to it a little later. Instead, let's focus on the events surrounding Livia Buchanan's mysterious death. Given that she gave birth to Victory sometime in the early 2060s, and that the Patriarch married his second wife in 2070, we can estimate that she died in the late 2060s. This would be around the time when Victory was just 3 to 5 years old. Not quite a baby, but definitely still a very young child. It's a timeline that seems to be confirmed by Angus Hoon, an elderly homesteader who lives a few miles outside of Colorado Springs. According to him, a beautiful woman wandered onto the Hoon homestead about 40 years ago, which would place it around the year 2067. This woman, later identified as Livia Buchanan, spent the night with the Hoons, left the next morning, and was later found hung to death in the nearby woods. Ostensibly, her death would appear to be a suicide. Her neck was broken and she was dangling from a noose, with a note tied to her body. This note simply read, "He took everything, so I chose nothing." The Hoons subsequently buried her, and since they had never learned her name, they used that cryptic note as the epitaph on her tombstone. However, it is very interesting to note that there is actually a much longer note that was buried with her body. Found in a small box containing various other personal effects, this note reads, "Saul, you told me you would kill me if I left you. I have decided to deny you the pleasure. I reject you, your ridiculous kingdom, and your ugly son. Death is better than another minute as your wife. L." A few days later, a few unidentified officials from Colorado Springs visited the Hoons, inquiring about the mysterious woman. The Hoons explained what had happened, and after inspecting her grave and apparently accepting their story, the officials left and never returned. The Patriarch apparently never had her body brought back to Colorado Springs. What's more, there are signs that he was genuinely remorseful or even guilty about her fate. I do have some things to say about that, but we'll come back to that a little later. Now this is where things start getting rather intriguing. The next hard date we have to work with is 2070, about 3 years after the mysterious death of his first wife, when the Patriarch married his second wife, Laura Buchanan. However, given that we know he remarried once more in 2072, we can assume that this marriage to Laura was exceptionally short, accounting for the time it would have taken her to come to terms with her daughter, Liberty. That would imply that she had died shortly after giving birth, and then the Patriarch went on to almost immediately marry his third wife. This would make Liberty Buchanan roughly 36 years old when Wasteland 3 takes place, with Valor being just a couple of years younger, somewhere in his early 30s. What makes this part of the timeline peculiar, however, is that Victory insists that Laura was cruel and duplicitous, even insinuating that Laura had physically abused him, and insisting that she had made his life a living hell for years, plural. It seems rather likely that their relationship began sometime before their actual marriage. Perhaps she was even impregnated before their official marriage in 2070. This begs the question of exactly how long Saul was involved with Laura, given that it would move these hypothetical premarital dalliances with her closer and closer to the date of the mysterious death of his first wife, roughly 3 years earlier. Regardless of the exact timeline, it does seem very suspect, especially after you learn about how Laura died. She was executed by the Patriarch for trying to kill him and usurp his throne. While there are no overt signs of foul play on her body, this does seem to match up with a few of the other clues that the player can uncover. There are numerous signs that the Patriarch favored Laura over both of his other wives. She's the only one he refers to as beloved in his portraits. He buried her in a prominent spot in Colorado Springs, and she was interred in a fine wooden casket, wrapped in silks and surrounded by trinkets and flowers. This stands in stark contrast to Livia, who was left buried in a shallow grave out in the woods, as well as Cleo, who was buried in a plain grave next to a ski shop in Aspen. Making things even stranger, Laura was also interred rather inexplicably with a military-grade energy handgun. It seems very likely that this handgun is, in fact, the same weapon she used in that failed plot. Victor insists that despite the fact that she had plotted against the Patriarch, he still loved her, even after he was forced to kill her. Vic even goes so far as to claim that the Patriarch's hasty marriage to Cleo in 2072 was a rebound to help him get over what had happened with Laura. Vic notes that Cleo was a boring and unintelligent woman, a much safer choice after the duplicitous and murderous Laura. But there are multiple signs that the Patriarch would later regret this hasty remarriage. Multiple clues seem to indicate that while the Patriarch loved Livia and Laura, he did not love Cleo, and didn't particularly care about her subsequent death. NPCs do state that she was a rather unremarkable woman, and that she didn't last long. This takes a rather dark turn if the player decides to disinter her body, at which point they will discover that she died of very unnatural causes. A single bullet hole, right in the center of her forehead. While we never really find out much more about poor Cleo, we can probably assume the worst. If questioned about how his wives died, the Patriarch will react with indignation and quickly change the subject, instead simply insisting that he eventually realized he couldn't love a woman without compromising his ability to also lead Colorado. Some rather peculiar details do end up creeping into his angry retort, however, including a grudging admission that he only loved most of his wives, likely a reference to poor Cleo. He would also note that while he had no plans to remarry, there was one other woman he would have considered, a woman who loved Colorado just as much as he does. While he refuses to give any further details about this woman, context clues seem to imply that he's talking about Sheriff Daisy, his former bodyguard, and the current leader of the Patriarch's Marshals. Building on that, it is interesting to note that if you speak to Daisy, she does indeed imply that the Patriarch was physically attracted to her. She also notes that she began working for Saul about 30 years ago, which would place it around 2077, just a few years after the Patriarch's third marriage. This could, of course, be a simple coincidence, but it could also be interpreted as a possible motivation for why the Patriarch would want to get rid of poor Cleo. Again, there's no real confirmation that Saul actually played any direct role in Cleo's death, but he definitely doesn't seem to have actually cared about her, and it does beg the question of why he would cover up her violent death. As a side note, and I did say we'd be coming back to this, the year 2073 is another one of the few hard dates that we have to work with. In this case, it marks the year of the Broadmoor Petting Zoo incident, an event which somehow resulted in the death of an animal from the petting zoo, with its head subsequently being mounted on the wall in Victory Buchanan's room. According to Victory, he claims that the animal bit him, but only after he had provoked it by biting it first. While there are numerous references to Victory's youthful cruelty, this is the first confirmed incident, and it conveniently takes place shortly after the death of the Patriarch's second wife, at his own hands, and his marriage to a third. Beyond that, we have a much hazier period of roughly 20 years, during which time the Patriarch and Daisy were preoccupied with their war against the Plains gangs, and the Scrap Hunters in particular. We know that the final major battle with the Scrap Hunters took place in 2097 at the Battle of Pumpkin Center, something confirmed by one of the Patriarch's personal trophies in his palace. This seems to mark the end of his war against the Plains gangs, which would also mark the point where he officially rewarded Sheriff Daisy by placing her in command of the Colorado Marshals. The fourth and final portrait that you can find on the Patriarch's wall is one depicting him posing with all three of his now adult children, dated 2105. Quan implies that this photo is fake or staged, but if we assume that it's genuine, it would imply that the Patriarch's children didn't overtly turn on him until sometime between 2105 and 2107. This does make some degree of sense, as it would set the stage for the events of the main campaign in those 2 years immediately before the campaign actually starts. This would be when Victory was finally punished for his wanton acts of murderous cruelty by being placed under house arrest in the luxury resort in Aspen. It would also mark the point where Liberty would steal the codes for the Patriarch's security network from her younger half-brother, Valor, and use them to shut down the city's defenses and stage her first overt coup attempt against her own father, an attempt which would ultimately fail, if just barely, leading her to flee east into the Kansas plains. Fearing that Valor had played a deliberate role in Liberty's coup, despite his insistence to the contrary, the Patriarch essentially exiled Valor by making him an ambassador to the Gippers, a Reagan-worshipping cult that also happened to control the main oil supply in Colorado. Now, this timeline already paints a pretty fascinating picture, but combined with various bits and pieces of other information that the player can uncover, it also suggests all sorts of rather intriguing motivations for the main characters involved. For example, while all three of the Patriarch's wives are dead by the time the campaign begins, their behavior, and the Patriarch's behavior towards them, can be linked to the way each of their respective children turned out. For example, Liberty was the daughter of Laura Buchanan, the Patriarch's second wife, and the only one to make an overt attempt to kill him and steal his throne. Although Laura died when Liberty was still very young, her mother's ambitions seem to have heavily shaped Liberty's singular driving goal to someday lay claim to the Patriarch's throne, whether legitimately or otherwise. Liberty was terrifying even as a little girl, obsessed with someday ruling Colorado. She felt it was her destiny, and that's certainly understandable. Given how swiftly Laura moved to act against the Patriarch right after they were officially married and Liberty had been born, it does seem to insinuate that the entire relationship and Liberty's birth were just parts of Laura's grand plot to steal the Patriarch's throne. This is further amplified by Victory's claims about Laura being abusive and cruel towards him. He also claims that Liberty had tried to assassinate him on no less than 6 occasions. Given that Victory would indeed be the first in line for the throne, as the eldest of the Patriarch's children, it makes sense that both Laura and Liberty would see him as little more than a major obstacle standing between them and a legitimate claim to the throne. For his part, Victory's behavior is seemingly irrational and psychotic, but given the circumstances of his upbringing, you can kind of understand how he ended up that way. His mother died shortly after he was born. He was convinced his father hated him, and he was allegedly abused, possibly even attacked by the Patriarch's second wife when he was just 7 or 8 years old. As he grew up, he also became thoroughly convinced that his mother had not just died or run off, but that she had instead been killed by the Patriarch for plotting against him. If taken to her grave, Victory will explain that he grew up hearing rumors about how his mother had killed 2 guards while escaping from Colorado Springs, but that the Patriarch had eventually caught up with her and shot her in the back of the head. This is particularly interesting, both because we know that Cleo, the Patriarch's 3rd wife, was in fact shot in the head, and that his 2nd wife was killed for plotting against him. It's easy to see why Victory would have bought into these rumors about what happened to his own mother. Victory also interpreted his father's stubborn silence about Livia's fate as a sign of hatred or spite, which would only reinforce Victory's belief that his father had done something to her. Granted, that certainly does not excuse the atrocities that Victory would go on to commit. But given how powerful his father was, an inability to hurt his father physically could easily force Victory to instead resort to hurting him emotionally. Acting out and hurting others might have been something that he saw as being an entirely rational way to behave, at least in his own twisted mind. That makes even more sense when you take the Patriarch's own harsh and sometimes cruel behavior into account. After all, the Patriarch makes no apologies for some of the more brutal things that he has done to maintain his grip on Colorado. Hope Emerson, the Ranger's jailer, notes that there are stories about how, as a child, Victory would often visit the pillories to ridicule the Patriarch's prisoners, who were left to be maimed or to die of exposure for sometimes minor crimes. Viewing this seemingly casual and disproportionate cruelty, coupled with his fervent belief that the Patriarch had killed at least 2 of his own wives, could definitely contribute to Vic's own pathologically violent behavior. It's particularly interesting to note that multiple NPCs will acknowledge Victor is particularly cruel towards women, which of course is horrific, but again makes some twisted amount of sense, given his wildly unhealthy relationship with Laura and Liberty while he was growing up. Not to mention how his own father seemed to have a habit of murdering his own wives. It's definitely worth mentioning that if the player does end up recruiting Vic and digging up his mother's grave at his request, the discovery that she might have actually just killed herself does seem to have a very profound effect on him. He denies it, of course, but not very well. Sadly, I don't think this actually has any long-term impact on the role he ultimately ends up playing in the story, but it is very interesting to see him struggling to come to grips with the idea that the main reason he might have for hating his father could be based on a lie. Of course, in both of their cases, Liberty and Victory, their aberrant behavior would only be magnified by the apparent complete lack of meaningful repercussions for their cruel and immoral actions. For whatever reason, the Patriarch simply refused to ever give them more than a token slap on the wrist, no matter how terrible the crime they would commit. For example, a somewhat obscure bit of lore that can only be found on one of the loading screens notes that up until Vic was exiled to Aspen, the Patriarch maintained an annual fund just for paying off the families of Victory's victims. Even that exile was a token punishment, as the Patriarch dismissed the growing demands that Victory be executed for his heinous crimes, and instead sent him to live in a posh luxury resort. This would even escalate to the level of absurdity during the events of the main campaign. Vic, for example, tortured and killed dozens of people after taking over Aspen. The Patriarch would instead insist that Vic was not responsible, and was instead simply misguided, despite knowing that the 100 families would never actually accept this explanation. Likewise, his forgiveness towards Liberty was equally absurd. While he had executed Laura Buchanan for turning against him, he instead treated Liberty with kid gloves, despite making a very similar attempt to forcibly claim his throne. He would order the player to recover Liberty alive, and spend the rest of his life trying to fruitlessly mend his relationship with her, despite the fact that her singular driving goal in life was to see him dead and destroy everything that he had ever built. This behavior might loop back around to the apparent guilt and remorse that the Patriarch felt about how his first 2 marriages had ended. For all of his flaws, the Patriarch did seem to genuinely care about both Livia and Laura. His excessively lenient behavior towards their children, Victory and Liberty, might be an extension of the guilt that he felt about what he had done to their mothers. Perhaps refusing to punish them or hold them to account for their actions was his misguided way to attempt to make amends or to show them love. Or, as with various other things, it could have also simply been a sign that the Patriarch refused to face the grim reality of an unfixable situation, or perhaps simply a refusal to accept the idea that he could ever fail. Regardless, this complete lack of meaningful punishment actually did a grave disservice to both Victory and Liberty. Devoid of any real consequences for their increasingly horrendous actions, they were deprived of a chance to grow past their very raw and basic issues with their father. Instead, their hatred just grew to impossibly gargantuan levels, leading them to perform increasingly spectacular acts of violence. Which does bring us back to Valor, who I haven't really talked about much here, and for good reason. Much like Cleo, Valor came third. Cleo was the forgotten wife, and Valor was essentially the forgotten son. Deprived of his mother at an early age, just like his half-siblings, Valor was ignored and demeaned by his own family for being the sole intellectual in a family of violent and often cruel personalities. Multiple NPCs would express sympathy for Valor, noting that he was terribly neglected and misunderstood, but that caused him to grow up to become a peevish and easily offended loner, believing himself to be intellectually superior to everyone else. He desperately yearned for some form of approval or affection, especially from a father figure. As odd as it might sound, this could explain why, if the player inspects his bed, they'll discover robot-themed erotica. Given his love of machines and his distinct lack of human contact, it seems natural that he would seek affection elsewhere. Likewise, his yearning for approval from a father figure would also easily explain his fascination with Ronald Reagan, who by 2107 would essentially be both a machine and a father figure. It's no surprise that he was so quick to not only join the Gippers, but to also turn them against his real father. Honestly, although this does move into the realm of pure speculation, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that he had somehow manipulated his father into sending him to stay with the Gippers in the first place. He certainly makes no secret of how stupid he thinks the rest of his family truly is. The real tragedy where Valor is concerned is that, unlike his siblings, he actually does seem to have a vested interest in trying to have some sort of positive relationship with his father, or at least he did. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the Patriarch simply had no apparent interest in growing closer with his youngest son. It's a very stark contrast to how generously Saul treated Victory and Liberty in comparison, grumbling but otherwise turning a blind eye to even their most blatant transgressions, while instantly punishing Valor for even the possibility that he could have been part of Liberty's failed coup. Something which, incidentally, Valor was not actually guilty of, based on information gleaned from dialogue with all three of the Buchanan heirs. It sounds like Liberty simply broke into Valor's room and stole the security codes from him without his knowledge, knowing that he would be too scared to do anything about it. Liberty makes it clear that, while he is intelligent, she would never actually trust Valor with any sort of actual responsibility. She also makes it clear that, while she doesn't care if he lives or dies, she doesn't really consider him to be much of a threat, as opposed to her urgent insistence that the Rangers should kill Victory the second they encounter him. Again, this lends itself to Liberty's own ruthless ambition and complete lack of a moral compass. To her, people are just tools or obstacles to be used or removed as necessary. Somewhat poetic, given the fate of his mother, poor Cleo, and the way the Patriarch had essentially used and discarded her as well. Now this covers the majority of what I wanted to talk about, how the disparate collection of seemingly random clues that I was so fascinated by ended up linking together to create a surprisingly elaborate story. Still, while this does combine to create a very compelling picture, there are still a few nagging details that I just couldn't let go of. Specifically, the circumstances surrounding Livia Buchanan's death. The biggest question being, do we simply accept that she ran away from the Patriarch and killed herself to spite him? Or is it possible that she was actually murdered? If Livia was simply trying to hurt the Patriarch, then why would she run miles away from Colorado Springs before hanging herself? Why wouldn't she just do it there, where it would be impossible for him to ignore it? Why would she go to the trouble of traveling miles out to a random homestead, spend the night, and then wander off into the woods and kill herself the next morning? Sure, we do know that the Patriarch eventually found out where she was buried. He marked it on a map, after all. But what if the individuals who followed her out to the Hoon residence were just there to make sure that it looked like a suicide? Angus Hoon states that the only note they found on her body was the cryptic note about leaving the Patriarch with nothing. He did mention that they buried her with personal effects, but unless they were somehow kind enough to bury her without actually looking at those personal effects, how could they have possibly missed that second spiteful note that called the Patriarch out by name? I think it's very important to note the exact wording used when describing the box that the note is found in. The description specifically states that the filth-stained box lies upside down beside her, tossed into the grave by a careless hand. It's possible that this was done by Angus or his father, but why would they go through the trouble of not just respectfully burying Livia, but also crafting a tombstone for her if they really cared so little about her that they would just toss her personal effects haphazardly in with her body? Similarly, the note that the Hoons did find was strange, vague and cryptic. It might have implied that she meant to kill herself, but leaving the Patriarch with nothing could just as easily have indicated that she meant to run away and never come back. Plus, we don't even know if she wrote that note in the first place. Keep in mind, it was found tied to her body, not in her hand, not at her feet, or in her pocket. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in this sort of thing, but tying a cryptic note to your own body seems like a very strange way to go about this. That said, if we do accept the premise that her death was not self-inflicted, then who did it? Well, to me, the most obvious suspect is Laura, a woman who had designs for the Patriarch's throne and could have easily been engaged in some sort of affair with him before they were officially married. It's very intriguing that, despite the fact that they were married for less than 2 years, the Patriarch loved her so unconditionally, and by extension her daughter as well. If we do assume that Laura had deliberately seduced the Patriarch prior to their marriage, that it was all just part of her ambitious plot to marry him, bear his heir, and then eliminate him so that she could take control of Colorado, is it really so far-fetched to imagine that she might have also been involved in the death of his previous wife? I could very easily see a scenario where Laura seduced the Patriarch, engaged in an extended affair with him, and Livia found out about it. Perhaps she ended up fleeing from Colorado Springs to get away from Laura, realizing how dangerous she was. Or perhaps she fled in disgust at the idea that Saul would betray her. Either way, she ended up fleeing miles away from Colorado Springs before ending up dead in the woods with 2 suicide notes, one tied to her body and another thrown into her coffin. To the Patriarch, he might very well have accepted that she had legitimately taken her own life. Maybe she did threaten to leave him, and he had threatened to kill her if she did. Perhaps their marriage was simply unhappy. But if you add a potential affair to the mix, then I feel like the aftermath makes a bit more sense. It could also help explain his irrationally lax behavior towards punishing their children, Victory and Liberty. To the Patriarch's eye, they would be all he had left of the 2 women he had loved more than anything else, one of whom he had potentially driven to suicide, and the other who he had essentially doubled down with, only to discover that she had been manipulating him all along. Now, this has really gone on a lot longer than I originally intended, which I suppose could show how truly fascinating I find it to be. But I will wrap up with one last confusing observation. Apparently, Livia's grave was not originally intended to be found at the Hume homestead at all. This moves into the realm of cut content, something we've talked about before. In fact, we've talked about this specific piece of cut content before as well, the Everest Hotel and the surrounding suicide forest. In this particular case, if the player ends up recruiting Vic and then finds the Patriarch's map, Vic will become increasingly insistent on wanting to visit his mother's grave. One of the reminders he will give the player, however, has him inadvertently referring to her grave as being at the Everest. That is very significant, because for those who haven't seen my previous video about it, the Everest is home to a murder cult known as the Caretakers. While we don't know their exact motivations or methodologies, we do know that the Caretakers saw it as their responsibility to relieve the suffering of their guests. While this would start with lavish meals and exquisite comforts, like a 4-star hotel, it would always end with the Caretakers killing them and stringing their bodies up in the nearby forest, as if they had decided to end their own lives. There are multiple ways that we can interpret this. Perhaps in her efforts to escape the Patriarch, Livia had inadvertently stopped to rest at the Everest and fallen victim to their ploy. But if that was the case, then why would they go through the trouble of burying her body afterwards, instead of simply leaving her hanging from a tree? One possibility is that the Everest was originally intended to be located somewhere near the Hoon homestead, and that the Hoons buried her after finding her body and assuming that she had in fact killed herself. That doesn't really seem to track, though, because if they lived near the Everest, you'd think they'd be constantly discovering bodies hanging from trees. A possibility that I find more intriguing, however, is the idea that beloved Laura had intended to use the Caretakers as a scapegoat for Livia's death. Perhaps she was playing the part of a sympathetic friend, trying to help Livia escape an increasingly unhealthy relationship by sending her to what appeared to be a remote luxury resort. Once the Caretakers had done their grisly duty, it would just be a matter of placing spiteful notes on Livia's body. Granted, that still wouldn't explain how she had ended up buried, but perhaps that's the function that the mysterious, official-looking folk from Colorado Springs were originally intended to fulfill. Maybe upon finding the body and the attached notes, they would have buried her in a shallow grave, then traveled back to report her apparent suicide to the Patriarch, thus setting the stage for victory and the Rangers to find it 40 years later. I strongly suspect that if the Everest had ultimately made it into the game, this is indeed something that we would have found out more information about, not just Livia specifically, but the Patriarch's wives in general. I feel like it was a fairly extensive quest line that the player could have investigated in a more complete version of the game. Perhaps Livia's name would have been in the hotel's guest registry, or some incriminating letter would have been discovered in or around the hotel, linking Laura, or someone else, back in Colorado Springs to Livia's staged death. Then again, perhaps she really did just kill herself. Or perhaps it really was just a random act of violence, and she had just happened to stumble into the Everest by sheer chance, ending up dead as a result. Sadly, short of the Everest being restored to the game, I don't think that's something we'll ever really know. It's not much to go on, but it does open the door to some very intriguing possibilities. And at the end of the day, that's really what these videos are for. To collect lore, to analyze what it might mean, and to speculate about what could have been. Anyway, this is RetconRaider. I have now been talking for 45 minutes, so it is time to sign out. Thanks for listening.